Once I met a girl lost in a book, dreaming the past. Follow, she said, and jumped in a page. She smiled and she asked. Walked to Glenfinnan, waited with Charlie. We drank an old Leith, we were toasted by Robbie. We stood as they signed in our broth at the Abbey. She took me to places that I never thought you could see.
Hi. Welcome to the 5th episode of Random Scottish History's offerings for Independence Live. Today we're talking old Scottish sports, which include Kickba, or football, Bonspiel, or curling, and Gowf, or golf. And I think I chose this mainly for the football because there's quite a lot of information, but also because it's a winter sport and I felt like possibly people would be missing their football, so I thought we'd give a wee rundown in the summer. Disclosure, I am not into sports at all. Like, not any sport. I've not felt a pressure to even pretend to be into sports, being as my husband is also not into sports. We're a fairly arty, creative household. We don't have football on the TV ever. But in the spirit of things, I'm wearing a blagged football top, French, just to stay apolitical in the whole football thing. I'm afraid I don't have a Scotland football top. But it is blue, so that's nice. We're not going to be getting into the rises and falls of individual clubs. Clubs themselves are barely going to be mentioned. I'm not looking to instigate any kind of contention here. We're just going to talk about the history of the thing, I guess. There's not any clear evidence of when these sports first originated in Scotland. All we know is that they've been played for a very long time. With curling, you have old stones, carved stones having been found at the bottom of ponds, etc., that have been used in the winter, that can give some kind of idea of date. The same doesn't apply to football, I'm afraid. These things tended to be made out of biological matter, bladders and leather and things, so these weren't things made to last. And there are still a few old golf clubs kicking about. So we're going to talk ancient Scottish sports. With football, the first writings about football actually really come from its prohibition, along with golf and other unprofitable sports. 2 acts from James I cover why football was prohibited, from the 19th and 20th of May 1424. First being, item, it is decreed, and the king forbids, that any man play football under the pain of 4pence to the lord of the land as often as he is convicted by the sheriff of the land or his ministers, if the lords will not punish such trespassers. So, if you wanted to play football, it could get quite expensive for you. The second is item, that all men prepare themselves to be archers from when they are 12 years of age, and that in each £10 worth of land there be made bow marks, and especially beside parish churches, where men on holy days may come out and shoot at least 3 times and have practice of archery. And whoever does not practice archery, the lord of the land shall raise a wether, which is a male sheep, a ram, especially a castrated ram, from him. And if the lord does not raise it, the sheriff shall raise it to the king. They're not wanting you to play football. they are wanting you to shoot arrows. This was because one was not super beneficial to the defence of the country. Archery is very much promoted. Now, where I said that football could be an expensive sport, really it was only people with leisure time that ever found themselves able to play football. So for your lay working man that worked the land generally, and that made up the majority of the population, daylight hours were accounted for. You had stuff you needed to do when the sun was out. Leisure time tended to be the reading of stories, etc. Things that could be done in the house by firelight and candlelight. In the summer months, when in Scotland we see a lot of daylight, I think we maybe only get about 4 hours of nighttime sometimes, if that. Perhaps you'd have the kids out after their work had been done, any chores had been done. They'd maybe go out and kick a stone about or kick a made ball about. So if you're an adult or even a teenager finding yourself with time to play football, generally to the point where you're having to pay this fourpence, it's unlikely that you were of the working class. You're going to have had more leisure time to spend on that kind of pursuit, you know. James II in 1458 really just carried on his predecessor's act. They were really wanting any free time you had to be used in the warlike pursuits. They wanted you to know how to help defend your country. James III carried that on with his act. Out of bounds. These are unprofitable sports. These are of no use to your king and country. Finally, in 1491, James IV carries this on, that football, golf, or other similar unprofitable sports are not to be played anywhere in the realm, but for the common good and defence of the realm. The practice of shooting bows and archery butts are therefore ordained in each parish under the pain of 40 shillings, to be raised by the aforesaid sheriff and bailies from each parish each year, where it is found that archery butts or shooting practice is not done as is said. In this way we can tell that by the 15th century, the 1400s, football was already popular enough that it needed to be sanctioned against by Act of Parliament, because it was diverting people from what they considered to be more worthwhile pursuits. But by the 19th century, these prohibitions had obviously been a thing of the past for some time, and people were starting to bring back ancient sports. They were starting to become really popular again, but that led to some fairly interesting articles in the papers where you had quite a lot of people coming out going, no, but it was illegal, it should still be illegal, what's the point in this, kind of thing, you know. But obviously none of that prevented the sport getting to what it is these days. Clericus writes into the Perpetual Courier on the 24th of December 1835. His letter is entitled, "The Football, an Illegal Game." He writes, "Mr. Editor, some of your correspondents have of late been wasting much argument and no little classical learning on the important subject of the revival of ancient sports. If a quiet man like myself might be allowed a kick at the ball without running the risk of a cuff in return, I would suggest a new view of the subject, and one particularly interesting to such of the authorities as mean to take a share in the intended brouille, viz. its illegality. By the Act of the First Parliament of King James I, holden at Perth, May 1424, the 17th chapter is thus entitled, that na man play at the football. In the face of these repeated legislative enactments, which the wisdom of our ancestors considered necessary to suppress the public inclination for the games in question, I can hardly see how Conservatives, the Sheriff, his ministers, or other lords of the land, can conscientiously take part in the intended sports of Hansel Monday. That, however, is matter for their consideration, and not that of your humble servant and constant reader, Clericus." Which He seems like he's a little bit stuck up, doesn't he? There's quite a lot of that through the mid-19th century, but as we got into the later 19th century, clubs were being formed. The game was obviously becoming very popular, just generally amongst the population. For the Dundee Courier, for the 20th of January 1875, we have football. Sir, this athletic game is one of the most ancient in Scotland, as it was practised more than 5 centuries ago, and our quiet-going chief magistrate is not the only potentate who has tried to put it down. At the first Parliament of King James I held at Perth, the following Act was passed, that na man play at the football. In the account of the Shire of Forfar, written by Auchterlony of Gownd about 1682, he says, in his description of Edzell Castle, "It hath an excellent outer court, so large and level, that of old, when they used that sport, they used to play at the football there, and there are still 4 great growing trees, which were the dobs, or goals." It appears from this extract that obedience had been given to the Act of King James, and the game discontinued. It has been revived in modern times, but as it does not meet with the countenance or approval of our worthy Chief Magistrate, and he is not alone in his dislike to the game, he should order the Clerk of the Borough to put in force the provisions of the above recited Act against those who persist in practising the disallowed game. That's by Broughty Ferry. So again, while he's saying that it's gaining a lot of popularity in 1875, there are still people in authority coming out against it and trying to mitigate the playing of the sport in their areas. I feel like it was a bit late by that point, though. The Brechin Advertiser for the 10th of April 1877 has football. The sport has become very popular throughout Scotland during the past few years. The county of Forfar possessed very few clubs till within a very recent period. Now their numbers are legion. It will be interesting to the lovers of the game, and to the curious as well, to know that in the first Parliament of King James I, held at Perth, the year of God in 1424 years, and of his reign the 19th year, a law was enacted as follows. We know how that act goes. What reason Parliament, in its wisdom, had for this restriction, we leave it to better antiquarians than we are to determine, but would venture to guess that it was not in consequence of the danger of the sport, but that because it took them too much away from the more warlike sport of archery. That writer also speaks to it not being because it's dangerous, which I think was probably an argument that people were coming out with in a bid to kind of stem its popularity. The Dundee Evening Telegraph for the 20th of October 1888 has, notwithstanding the great popularity of football, much is said against the game. Some people, among them being clergymen and even our own learned sheriff, characterising it as brutal and degrading. All sorts of games may be abused, but because they are so abused, that is no reason why their use should be taken away. The game of football is of ancient origin, and it is uncertain when it was introduced into this country. We do not know whether in olden times it was so popular as it is now, but we have come across some relics of ancient history which show that the modern croakers had their prototypes 4 centuries ago. Indeed, so much so that the matter was brought under the notice of the King and his Parliament, who caused it to be prohibited. By the Act of King James II in 1457, Chapter 62, the jurisdiction was extended to barons and king's officers. During the subsequent reigns of James III and IV, the provisions against playing football were repeated. In the last of these statutes, golf and other unprofitable sports are combined with football, and the reason for the prohibition is stated to be for the common good of the realm and defence thereof. One would naturally gather from this that our forefathers considered the game dangerous to life and limb. At all events, they evidently did not look upon it as a healthy, recreative pastime, but rather recognised it as being attended with no benefit, and thought that the players might be better employed. The true reason, however, may be found in the subsequent provisions of some of the same statutes, which ordain shooting with bow and arrow to be practised instead. Archery was a method of warfare adopted in those days, and it was deemed prudent that all should be able to assist in that way in defending their country should occasion require. The laws don't give any hint as to the sport being banned due to brutality or injuries sustained or anything, though they were pretty violent. These games, they're not the games that you know of now. I know in Forfar they talk about there being a courtyard and goals, and it was all very highbrow, so to speak, for the age. People would have time to play such a game would be on festival days, maybe even market days. The towns would get together to have these rammies. The Perpetual Courier for the 3rd of December 1835 describes a wee bit how an original game might have been played. It's entitled As Fair at the Bonspiel. This saying has obtained a proverbial status in this quarter for many years and originated in the latitude of the principle by which an ancient sport, which has for more than a century fallen into desuetude, was regulated. This season the game has been revived under the special auspices of the noble family of Mansfield. Tuesday exhibited an animated scene in the Palace Park. The competition was restricted to the parishioners of Scone, but upwards of 300 individuals engaged in the contest. The married men were engaged in opposition to the bachelors and youth of the parish, and were distinguished by badges of ribbon. The young men wore white favours, the married displayed crimson. Viscount Stormont was an active leader of the latter, and his youngest brother, the Honourable David Murray, distinguished himself with no less zeal on the opposite side. The day, which looked exceedingly unfavourable during the morning, improved towards noon when the sports began, but the ground was in the very worst condition. This circumstance, however, tended to heighten rather than diminish the interest of the game in the eyes of the spectators, for the most ludicrous passages took place in consequence, and even the noble lord above mentioned was frequently involved in situations which, however laughable, were by no means enviable. Still, however, he continued to bear the brunt of the action, and to cheer on his brother Benedict's inglorious style. On his side he had the disadvantage of fellow combatants of nearly octogenarian age, who had engaged in the same tullier in days of yore, and actuated by a zeal in the revival of the sports of their youth, calling up to their minds so many pleasing recollections and associations, could not refrain from employing their bent-down bodies and stiffened limbs in the contest. It was a highly interesting sight, the fervour with which many engaged in it. In some places wives were seen cheering up the drooping spirits of their husbands. In others the better half would be shedding tears on account of the perils to which the partner of her joys and sorrows was exposed. Fortunately, with one exception, we have heard of no very material injury being incurred by anyone. The scene of action was chiefly to the northward of the Paris and occupied a space of nearly 2 miles. After a desperate struggle of nearly 2.5 hours, the unmarried sent the ball to the goal, and the individual who did so was carried in triumph shoulder high. Lord Stormont complained that this result must have been brought about by the occasional aid afforded by the youth of Perth and Canoe, who should have been spectators merely. But the odds were evidently against him. The concern altogether afforded much amusement. All grades of the parishioners engaged in the combat, and it was highly interesting to see the landed heritors and members of the noble family severally engaged on an equal footing and with equal zeal with the artisans of the village and the toil-worn sons of the soil. A stimulant was administered before commencing the sports, and refreshment served at their close, at the expense of the noble proprietor of the domain on which they were celebrated. That's not just showing you that they played for hours in a space that was about 2 miles of width, but it also worked to bring everyone together. It didn't matter your rank or station. All that really mattered in that game was that you were a guy and whether you were married or unmarried. But other than that, you could compete with your lord of the land at a game of football. Chambers, in his Book of Days for Candlemas, or the 2nd of February, backs this up. He says another old popular custom in Scotland on Candlemas Day was to hold a football match, the east end of the town against the west, the unmarried men against the married, or one parish against another. The Candlemas Ba, as it was called, brought the whole community out in a state of high excitement. On one occasion some years ago when the sport took place in Jedburgh, the contending parties, after a struggle of 2 hours in the streets, transferred the contention to the bed of the River Jed, and there fought it out amidst a scene of fearful splash and dabblement, to the infinite amusement of the multitude looking on from the bridge. It was like a festival day. It was something that people really looked forward to on their holiday. Which was, again, really the only time that your layman had to enjoy a game of football was going to be your festivals and holiday days. The Montrose Standard for the 4th of April 1890 tells us, in an article on Old World football in the Scots Observer, there are some interesting details regarding the history and antiquity of the game. The Scottish kings had actually to prohibit the game in 1424, 1451, 1471 and 1491, but the very repetition of the enactments is proof of their inefficiency. At all events, in 1497, footballs were purchased by James IV himself, probably for a game at court. In the next century, the game was played not merely by the gentry, but even by the monks and other ecclesiastics. Thus, Sir David Lindsay's abbot vindicates his presbyterial efficiency by setting his prowess at football against his neglect of the pulpit. "I wot there is nocht among you all more finely can play at the football." That even the highest nobles did not disdain the game is clear from the case of the 5th Earl of Huntly, who was seized with apoplexy, it was hereditary, while kicking off, and died the same night. The game seems to have been a common one at the court of Queen Mary. Sir Francis Knollys tells that when she was at Carlisle after the flight from Langside, about 20 of her retinue played at football before her the space of 2 hours, very strongly, nimbly, and skilfully, without any foul play offered. Their play struck Sir Francis as much superior to anything he had seen, and it is clear that the game in vogue at this time among the upper classes of Scotland differed radically from the common annual rough and tumble of later years. The real cause of decline and deterioration was prohibition of Sunday football by the Reformers. During the Covenanting and Cromwellian periods of ascendancy, football was in still greater disrepute, and Sir David Hume of Crossrigg records that in 1659, having, in accordance with a traditional custom of the second-year students at Edinburgh University, taken part in a game of football on the Borough Muir on the 11th of March, he was sentenced to be whipped in the class, and refusing to submit, was expelled by the university. The extraordinary revival of football, continues the writer, is an evidence that the old notions as to the sinfulness of enjoyment per se are practically extinct. Not less remarkable is the immense improvement in the supersession of savagery by skill, which has followed its adoption by the educated classes. Of course, there are prints moral and prints medical whose object is, by a long parade of accidents, to persuade the public to frown this pastime down as brutal and demoralising, and who in that way do their little best to make it both. That, though, is not the way to mend it, and to end it were merely impossible. And, after all, is it really so dangerous as that? Minor accidents are common enough, but so far as loss of life is concerned, is football as mortal as hunting, shooting, riding, yachting, bathing, or even doing nothing? Is it very much more deadly than crossing a crowded London street, or is it anything like so perilous as railway travelling? Perhaps some gentle statistician would oblige. The Southern Reporter for the 28th of March 1895 has a short article. The game of football was anciently a very favourite sport throughout Scotland, but especially upon the borders. Sir John Carmichael of Carmichael, Warden of the Middlemarches, was killed in 1600 by a band of Armstrongs returning from a football match. Sir Robert Carey, in his memoirs of border transactions, mentions a great meeting appointed by the Scottish riders to be held at Kelso for the purpose of playing at football, but which terminated, as more than one game of football did, in an incursion upon England. The Football News for the 18th of April 1896 has football in Glasgow. Glasgow, with its record crowd of 60,000 at the 1896 International, boasts the honour of having cradled, nay, more, of having conceived and born association alias soccer. Followers of the scholastic rugger are left to flatter themselves with the reflection, fairly well founded on fact, that though a ridiculous minority by comparison, they are still a select few. The legitimising of professionalism gave an enormous impetus to soccer by creating a new and eminently tempting vocation for hundreds who much prefer pedal to manual labour. Now we know that at the first Old Firm match, Celtic beat Rangers. But none of that matters, because both teams lost to Clyde Football Club at the start. We have the daily record for the 29th of August 1898. Football, incidents in the history of the Clyde, opening of Shawfield Park. Compared with the Celtic, the Clyde is an ancient organisation. If it cannot boast of having played such a conspicuous part in the history of the game as Celtic, the Clyde can plume itself in having served a very useful purpose to athletics. Queen's Park, as we all know, was the first club of any note in Glasgow. It blossomed into existence in 1867, Rangers and 3rd Lanark followed 5 years later, and in 1874 the Clyde was formed, and down till the end of last season its headquarters were located at Barrowfield Park. I remember well the circumstances linked with the Clyde's inception, the demise of the Old Eastern, a local rival. The Bridgeton enthusiast of bygone days loves to recall the many struggles the Clyde had with such powerful local rivals as the Northern, Cowlairs, Thistle and Cambuslang. Those clubs are now of the past. Those were happy times for the Clyde, for players' wages were unknown, and there was always the Thistle to keep things lively in the district. Two notable achievements on the part of the Clyde may be singled out in their Scottish Cup victories over the Rangers and Celtic. In September 1885, on the same day as W. Cummings of Paisley vanquished the ex-amateur champion of the world, W. G. George, in a 4 miles match at Powderhall, the Rangers' hopes were blasted at Barrowfield. 3 years elapsed between the Rangers and the Celtic wins, the latter taking place in November 1888 by 1-0. The Clyde did not long enjoy the sweets of victory, for on a protest to the Scottish Football Association, the Celts got another chance and misfortune attended the Clyde. This gave rise to considerable feeling at the time, but the clubs are good friends now. As a prominent Clyde official put it at Shawfield, "The Celts supported us today to a man." Saturday's opening was inauspicious in every sense of the word, for the takings yielded record for the Clyde, and if Lord Kinnaird did not grace Shawfield as he did Ibrox when Preston North End opened Rangers ground, Provost Edmiston of the ancient and royal borough of Rutherglen performed the ceremony of kicking off in the presence of his municipal colleagues and the dignitaries of the district. Football was well represented, and to crown all, the Clyde players rose to the occasion and divided points with the champions of last season. Glasgow has always apparently been the home of football. McGeorge, in his Old Glasgow of 1880, writes, "Another favourite amusement of the Glasgow people was football, a game for which their green was well adapted. This game was prohibited by the old Acts of Parliament, as it was thought to interfere with the practice of archery, but James IV was fond of it, and notwithstanding the law, he often indulged in it himself. It was certainly encouraged and promoted by the magistrates of Glasgow, who always provided the footballs, and the borough minutes from the very earliest of times of which there is any record contain notices on the subject. From one of these, in 1575, we learn that the price of a football was 2d. From another in the beginning of the 17th century, we learn that there was given upon the 28th day of February 1609 to John Neil Cordner, younger, for footballers, to the town, at fasterance even, conform to the auld use, 26 shillings 7d. So there you go. We'll quickly cover golf. Golf, again, was also super Scottish game. The Scotsman, for the 30th of July 1831, under an article entitled Leith Golfing, has, "In ancient times Leith was distinguished for nothing so much as its golf playing. This healthful Scottish game was practised by all classes with a degree of frank and free hilarity, which has long since ceased to animate the modern practice of this manly pastime. The great extent and the inequalities of the golfing ground, well known by the name of the links, afforded every facility to golfers. during the last 18th century, the greatest and wisest of the land were to be seen on the links of Leith, mingling freely with the humblest mechanics in pursuit of their common and beloved amusement. All distinctions of rank were levelled by the joyous spirit of the game. Lords of session and cobblers, knights, baronets and tailors might be seen earnestly contesting for the palm of superior dexterity, and vehemently but good-humouredly discussing most points of the game as they arose in the course of the play. There were, in particular, during the middle of last century, a batch of lively, active old fellows who made golfing the almost sole business of their lives. Each of these veterans, according to Smollett, was turned of 80, and never went to bed a night without having under their belts the best part of a gallon of claret. Before the present Golfers' Tavern was built, which was in the year 1768, the merry golfers used to assemble in a tavern kept by one Straighten at the head of the Kirk Gate. James II, Charles I and his son, James Duke of York, have all successively played at golf on the links of Leith, although the first of these royal personages, during the latter part of his reign, issued an edict against the practice of this game, as it was thought to interfere with the more important exercise of the bowl. The unfortunate King Charles was engaged in this pastime on the links of Leith when he first got intelligence of the Irish rebellion in 1642, which affected him so deeply that he instantly left the ground and proceeded to London. It is a fact as singular as it is demonstrative of the low state of the arts in Scotland that, notwithstanding the antiquity and popularity of the game, all the golf balls were bought from abroad, principally from Holland. This began to be considered in the time of James IV a serious national expenditure, insomuch that that monarch, in order to encourage the manufacture of that article at home, and to save money to the country, granted a charter dated the 14th of April 1603, appointing one James Melville and others to the office of golf ball makers for the reasons mentioned and thus expressed in that deed, that there is no small quantity of gold and silver transported yearly out of His Highness's Kingdom of Scotland for buying of golf balls. So again, golf was another ancient Scottish sport that just brought everyone together, that it didn't matter like whether you were a king or a lord or a tailor or a farmer. If you could play the game and you wanted to play a game, have at it, you know? I feel like that very much goes in line with Scots policy in general, where they didn't ever really see their authorities as being very much better than them. The authorities were there on behalf of them and for their benefit, you know. They were there just to regulate things, and if they didn't do it right, there was an outcry and the person was removed. It was always a very democratic kind of societal feeling within Scotland throughout the centuries. These sports really just highlighted that, the fact that these lords and people of note would deign mix with your common working man in a time when class distinction made a really big deal in general society. We're getting to the 20th century, actually, with this article from the Dundee Evening Telegraph for the 17th of January 1930. Why golf is the royal and ancient game, the origin of the 19th hole. Scores of thousands of golfers talk glibly about the royal and ancient game of golf, but why royal? Why ancient? Why cannot these terms be equally well applied to football, cricket, or some of the other games which have had such a long popularity in our country? It is rather interesting to delve deeply into the history of the golf game, particularly when we remember that we have the veritable home of the sport at our own door, St Andrews. Many historians are agreed that it was in the Fifeshire town that the sport, if not really invented, was at least placed on something of a definite footing. Just when it was first played there, it is difficult to surmise. It has been proved, however, that when St Andrews University was founded in 1413, golf had already secured a big hold on the people of Scotland and was quite widely played, particularly in the St Andrews and Edinburgh districts. The rights of the people of St Andrews to the links, particularly for playing golf, football, shooting and all other manner of pastimes, were ratified by the Archbishop of St Andrews in 1553 and confirmed by him in 1614 and by King James VI in 1620. These facts are sufficient to explain the ancient portion of the phrase so often used to describe golf, the world's elect 55. The royal part also applies to St Andrews, for in 1834 His Majesty King William IV gave his consent for the St Andrews Golf Club, as it then was, to carry the name of the Royal and Ancient Golf Club of St Andrews. This club was founded way back, about 1754, although the present clubhouse was not erected until 1840 and has since been considerably extended and improved. No golf club can attach the word royal to itself without the favour of the King and Queen. It is interesting to know that there are only 55 royal golf clubs in the world, of which 20 are English, 15 colonial, 10 Scottish, 5 Irish, 3 Belgian and 2 Welsh. The Scottish societies which have been thus honoured are the Royal and Ancient, Royal Aberdeen, Montrose Royal Albert, Braemar Royal Cragan, Royal Dornoch, Royal Musselburgh, Edinburgh Royal Burgess, Macduff Royal Tarlaire, Royal Duff House, Banff, and Royal Perth Golfing Society. If Fifeshire people played golf before those of Angus, it was not by long, for interesting reference is made in the Registrum D. Pinmuir to the playing of the game on the links of Barry. This famous history ranges from 1066 to 1733, when it was completed by Earl James Panmure while he was living in exile in France. From it is obvious that golf in the Carnoustie district dates back till long before the town itself was ever thought of. In the same history, mention is made of the fact that the players of the game invariably made it a point of having liquid refreshment at the end of the match, and it was a custom to make the payment of these refreshments the stake for which the game was played. It is obvious, therefore, that the 19th hole has grown up along with the game. Smollett on golf. Another interesting reference to this fact is made by Smollett in Humphrey Clinker, which was published in 1771. In this book, Smollett comments on the people of Edinburgh playing a game called golf, in which they use a curious kind of bats tipped with horn and small elastic balls of leather stuffed with feathers, rather less than tennis balls. He goes on to say that the game is played by all kinds of people, from the Senator of Justice to the lowest tradesman. Then he comments on one set of golfers, the youngest of whom was turned 80. They had amused themselves with this pastime for the best part of a century without ever having felt the least alarm from sickness or disgust, and they never went to bed without having each the best part of a gallon of claret in his belly. These are interesting sidelights on the game, which today is probably the most worldwide of all sports and the most international in its appeal and similarity of rules. They also give some foundation for the claim of the game to be both royal and ancient. In the Scottish National Memorials, an 1890 publication for the chapter entitled Golf, etc., it tells us the royal and ancient game of golf is peculiarly a product of the Scottish soil, and is implied in the designation it is of remote origin. As also implied in the term royal, it was a pastime of monarchs and still continues to be a recreation of the wealthy and well-to-do classes. That the game was eagerly prosecuted so early as the middle of the 15th century we have the most ample evidence, for in the year 1457 the Scottish Parliament decreed and ordained that the football and golf be utterly cried down and knocked use it, and that the bowmerks be made at ilk parish kirk, a pair of butts and shooting be used at ilk Sunday. Such legislation, having for its object the encouragement of arts of war, was subsequently renewed from time to time in the Statute Book, the last act in 1491, in which football and golf are forbidden, being not yet repealed. The monarch himself, at that time, James IV, who made these laws, showed an example to other lawbreakers as an eager and enthusiastic golfer. James V also showed his subjects an example as a law-breaking golfer, and even Queen Mary, it is said, was seen playing golf in Pall Mall in the field beside Seaton a few days after Darnley's murder. The game was also patronised by James VI and his sons Harry and Charles. The latter, when Charles I was playing over Leith Links in 1642 when the news of the Irish rebellion of that year reached him. It is on record that James VII, while Duke of York, played on Leith Links with John Patterson, shoemaker, against 2 English nobles, and that large stakes won by the king and cobbler were given to the latter, who with them built the tenement known as Golfer's Land, 77 Canongate, Edinburgh. Statutory prohibition appears to have had little effect in discouraging golfers in Scotland, for in 1592 the Edinburgh Town Council made proclamation that, seeing the Sabbath day being the Lord's day, it becomes every Christian to dedicate himself to the service of God, therefore commanding in our sovereign Lord's name, and in name of the Provost and Bailies, that na inhabitants of the samen be seen at ony pastimes within or without the town upon the Sabbath day, sic as Gowf, etc. Nor does the sanctity of the sanctuary itself appear to have been proof against the allurements of golf, for on the 16th of October 1589 the Kirk Session of Glasgow resolved that there be no playing in future of golf, carry or shinny in the High Kirk or Kirkyard or Blackfriar Kirkyard, either Sunday or work day. Yeah, golf. Scottish, ancient, royal. There was regulations brought in at the end of the 19th century stopping people from just using whatever clubs they wanted. Apparently some would use like mallets similar to croquet mallets in some cases. There was quite a lot of outcry about the regulations and the fact that clubs had to be of a standard form, etc., as well as the balls. It didn't seem to stop the progress in that regard though. So next we have Bonspiel, or curling, which is also apparently an ancient Scottish sport. Chambers' Book of Days for January gives us a good introduction to curling. He tells us, amusements prevailed during dry frost in Scotland, with one more, as yet little known in the south. It bears the name of curling, and very much resembles bowls in its general arrangements, only with the specialty of flat stones to slide along the ice instead of bowls to roll along the grass. Two parties are ranged in contention against each other, each man provided with a pair of handled stones and a broom, and having crampets on his feet to enable him to take firm hold of the glassy surface. They play against each other to have as many stones as possible lying near a fixed point, or tee, at the end of the course. When a player happens to impel his stone weakly, his associates sweep before it to favour its advance. A skip or leader stands at the tee, broom in hand, to guide the players of his party as to what they should attempt, whether to try to get through a certain open channel amongst the cluster of stones guarding the tee, or perhaps to come smashing among them in the hope of producing rearrangements more favourable to his side. Incessant vociferation, frequent changes of fortune, the excitation of a healthy physical exercise, and the general feeling of socialty evoked all contribute to render curling one of the most delightful amusements. It is further remarkable that in a small community the curling rink is usually surrounded by persons of all classes, the laird, the minister, and the provost being all hail fellow well met on this occasion with the tailors, shoemakers, and weavers, who at other times never meet them without a reverent veiling of the beaver. Very often a plain dinner of boiled beef with greens concludes the merry meeting. There is a Caledonian curling club in Scotland, embracing the highest names in the land, and having scores of provincial societies affiliated to it. They possess an artificial pond in Strathallan near the line of the Scottish Central Railway, and thither sometimes converge for one day's contention representatives from clubs scattered over fully 150 miles of country. It just shows you, everyone would get together for these games. It didn't matter what rank you were, it didn't matter how high up you were in society or how low. If that was your game, you were very welcome to play it. We have from the Scotsman for the 21st of January 1829, New Curling Pond. Mr. John Carney of Largs, both during the last and the present winter, succeeded in forming a curling pond. So late as Tuesday and Wednesday last, he and his friends played various games, when in all probability not a single stone was thrown in any other part of Scotland. And as the details of his plan for forming a curling pond were lately communicated to us, we lose no time in submitting them to our readers. The first thing, then, that Mr. Carney does after selecting a piece of ground 50 yards long by 22 feet broad, is to level and free it from weeds and grass. The bottom is next lined with clay brought from the shore, and it is calculated that 130 carts will cover such an area as we have just described, and prevent any material absorption of water. Care is then taken to form an embankment round and round, clayed to the top for the same purpose, but the height of which need not exceed half a foot. On the appearance of frost, the pond is flooded. if flooding it can be called, to the depth of little more than half an inch by means of a cistern or tiny rill, which it is easy to turn from its natural course, but if a few heavy showers fall previously, it is of course unnecessary to take this trouble. From the nature of the bottom and the shallowness of the water, a pond constructed on Mr. Carney's principle bears sufficiently in 10 or 12 hours, even when the thermometer oscillates at, rather than falls below, the freezing point, so that the curler, like his friend the miller at a different season, has only to prepare his dam at night and fall to work next morning. And what is remarkable, ice obtained in this way, from the whole mass being completely frozen, is so true and level and bends so little that it is better for curling than any other, a circumstance worth taking into account when a Bonspiel is played by the skilful representatives of rival parishes, and by the liberal use of watering pans, with willing hands to guide them, a new coating of ice may be formed every night, that the stone may go booming along and the office of the broom becomes a sinecure. Here Mr. John Carney, he knows what he's about. He knows how to bypass that so that he can get in his game of curling whenever he wants to. As long as it's winter and it's cold enough, he seems to be a wee bit ahead of the rest of them. The Perthshire Advertiser for the 27th of January 1842 gives us the annual of the Grand Caledonian Curling Club for 1842. In a well-written preface, we are told that the Grand Club was instituted in 1838 for the purpose of uniting all curlers into one brotherhood or rink, and of regulating the ancient game of curling by general laws, and that its success has exceeded the most sanguine expectations of its promoters, in proof of which 90 clubs have already joined the Grand Club, which now consists of about 3,000 members, and these not confined to Scotland but numbering brethren across St. George's Channel and beyond the Atlantic. The historical sketch of the game now given was a desideratum which, at a glance, will be seen ably and succinctly to embody all that is known with certainty on this head, and the inference drawn from no records of curling being found in the writings of the antiquary and historian prior to the beginning of the 17th century, that therefore the 16th century must have been the era of its invention or introduction into Scotland, is afterwards very properly qualified by subsequent remarks. After an interesting reference to an account of curling stones found in ponds of acknowledged antiquity, bearing very ancient dates, it is added, it may happen that curling may be proved from such hidden sources to have existed in Scotland at a period considerably beyond the chronological dates which its history supplies. It is added, it may happen that curling may be proved from such hidden sources to have existed in Scotland at a period considerably beyond the chronological dates which its written history supplies, and taking the many collateral facts into consideration, few, we are disposed to believe, will dispute the opinions here expressed. As at least an amusing collateral circumstance, it is stated by the ingenious author of the Memorabilia Mabinensia that in the Carse of Gowrie there is a model of a curling stone in silver, which is played for annually by several parishes. Tradition reports that it was given by James IV of Scotland, 1473 to 1513, who was a keen curler, and elsewhere, of the remote antiquity of the game of curling, we have the most legitimate proof from Ossian. Fly, son of Morven, fly, amid the circle of stones, Swaran bends at the stone of might. Either the game, then, is much more ancient than has hitherto been dreamed of, or else Macpherson has been most unhappy in his illusion. So you know our man before, who had to create his own rink, because people couldn't curl every single year. It wasn't every year that the ponds would freeze thick enough to be able to have a good game. The Aberdeen Press and Journal for the 21st of February 1929 gives us something of an evolution. Perpetual Curling. Scots to have roaring game the year round. A grievance of the Scot has always been that for years no sooner has the ice become strong enough for curling than a thaw has set in, with the result that Scots desiring to play the national game have had to go to Switzerland or a similar rendezvous to do so. Among those who have felt keenly the lack of proper facilities for curling is the Duke of Montrose, a curler of no mean ability. In opening an ice rink recently, he remarked that it was, in his opinion, almost a scandal that people nowadays should have to go to Switzerland to indulge in the good old Scottish sport. This lack of facilities will soon be a thing of the past, for ice rinks are being opened in London and other parts of the country so that curling and skating will be practicable all the year round, and Scots will be able to pursue their national sport, independent of the vagaries of the frost. Women have taken up skating on artificial ice with keenness, and well they might, for there is no healthier exercise, nor one better calculated to develop the figure. Important. Lady Mary Graham is well known as an expert curler, and she and many other ladies are members of the curling section of the new Scottish ice rink in Glasgow, which is realising the highest hopes of its promoters. There you go. Finally, year-round curling. You don't have to be beholden to the elements to be able to get a good game in. In Grant's Old and New Edinburgh of 1880, for a chapter entitled Arthur's Seat and its Vicinity, he has an excerpt. He says, most performers belong to skating clubs, fraternities constituted for the cultivation of the art as an art and to enforce proper regulations. In Edinburgh there is one such society of old standing, whose favourite ground is Duddingston Loch, under the august shadow of Arthur's Seat. The writer recalls with pleasure skating exhibitions which he saw there in the hard winters early in the present century, when Henry Cockburn and the philanthropist James Simpson were conspicuous amongst the most accomplished of the club for their handsome figures and great skill in the art. The scene of that loch, in full bearing on a clear winter day, with its busy stirring multitude of sliders, skaters and curlers, the snowy hills around glistening in the sun, the ring of the ice, the shouts of the careering youth, the rattle of the curling stones and the shouts of the players, once seen and heard, could never be forgotten. So we've covered Kickba, or football, Gowf, or golf, and Bonspiel, or curling. There are a couple of miscellaneous sports that I'm not entirely sure I'd come across before, so maybe we have time to cover these a wee bit. The Dundee Courier for New Year's Day of 1934 gives us Ancient Fife Games Today, Kirkcaldy and Wemyss contests. At Kirkcaldy and Wemyss this morning, two ancient Nerd Day games peculiar to the respective places will be played. On Dominic's Green at Ravenscraig Park, Kirkcaldy, the game that will be played is called A Bobby She Kyles. The origin of the game is obscure, but the procedure and rules of play are simple. On the green, which is now, and as far as is known always was, a rather bumpy, unkempt and undulating grassy plot, there is made an enlarged saucer-like hole. Towards this hole an iron ball is rolled, and if it enters a hole, she has kyled. The name of the game is derived from the fact that the spectators used to take on bets as to the result of each player's efforts. The familiar cry of a century ago was, "A Bobby she kyles," and immediately someone would take on the challenge with an answering, "A Bobby she doesn't." With the passing of the Bobby as a familiar token of exchange, the cry changed from that to "A halfpenny she kyles," and now, this being a reckless age, it is "A penny she kyles." The old name sticks, however. Today the game will start shortly after 10 o'clock, and it will be played with the original cannon ball, which is specially allowed each New Year's Day to be taken from Kirkcaldy Museum for the purpose. At East Wemyss, they call their game the Yetlins. It is played on the rocks, or rather the skellies. The game is played with a 23-ounce steel ball with a handle attached, and in several respects resembles the favourite Highland Games sport of putting the ball. There is a draw among the competitors for their turn to throw the Yetlin. The winner is he who throws it the greatest distance. Distance of throw. The untrained novice may manage to throw the ball 50 or 60 yards, but quite a common feat among the practised veterans at Wemyss is 150 yards, and over 200 yards is not unknown. The history of this game is hid in the shades of antiquity. There is awarded still to the winners a medal which was struck in 1847, and that is the earliest tangible record of the game's existence. It is almost certain, however, that the Yetlins is a sport of very much greater antiquity, for it has all the elements of a sport which would be popular in the primitive days of might is right. The game can only be played at certain periods of the tide, and today it is expected that play will start about 9 a.m. and continue for 2 hours. You can see from a lot of these old Scottish games that you could pretty much play any of them by making your own equipment. The Dundee Evening Telegraph for New Year's Day of 1935 has the Yetlins match postponed. Ancient sport at East Weems. The ancient game known as the Yetlands, which has been played at East Weems for fully 200 years, has been postponed owing to the rocks on the beach being covered with debris, which has been deposited from reconstructed houses nearby. The game is played with an iron ball weighing 22 ounces and flung by means of a strip of canvas wound round the ball and attached to the wrist of the thrower. The competitor who can manage to cover the distance, approximately 500 yards, with the least amount of throwing, is declared the winner. The medal now presented to the winner dates from 1849. And then we have a sad article denoting the end, I assume, of this old sport of a bobby shakeiles. The Fifeshire Advertiser for the 5th of January 1952 has "Nobody turned up for ancient game, a bobby shakeiles. New Year's Day 1952 was unique in one respect. Not a soul turned up for the ancient game of a bobby shakeiles, played in the Ravenscraig Park from time immemorial. Nobody followed the old custom of calling at the museum on Hogmanay to borrow the 8-pound iron ball used in the sport. Only a handful of spectators turned up last year to witness the game played on Dominic's Green, a rough, grassy slope overlooking the Forth. The object is to roll the iron ball into any of the 9 holes arranged in groups of 3. The players bet as to whether or not the ball will kyle, that is, drop into a hole. Needless to say, penny stakes have replaced the bobby, but it now looks as if the annual Wraith Rovers vs East Fife game has drawn the spectators and players away from this ancient sport. But it hasn't always been like this, as our photographs show. I like the idea of a bobby shakeiles being brought back into tradition. I think it would need to be more than just myself with a desire for that, but I like the idea of that. So we're going to end with an article from the Aberdeen Evening Express for the 21st of July 1978, which is far more contemporary than Random Scottish History usually gets, but I enjoyed this article. Scotland's recent football defeat could soon be erased by victory in another sporting world championship, the ancient and noble art of haggis hurling. The second of the championship's 10 heats will be held next Thursday in Dufftown, the highlight of their gala week. The event will be attended by Mr. Robin Dunseith, Secretary of the World Haggis Hurling Association, and Scotland's foremost chief hagrarian, Mr. Neil Scroggie. It is Mr. Scroggie's job to ensure that the haggises are in order and the rules obeyed. He must also inspect the hurling pitch and report on the going to the hurlers. Mr. James Murray, chairman of the Dufftown and District Games Association, said, "People have entered this heat from as far as the south of Scotland, but we don't know just how many haggis hurlers we'll have, as anyone can turn up on the day." World record. The world record of 149 feet 8 inches was set last year in Fochabers by Evan Clark. The first of this year's heats, held in Birmingham, was won by Englishman Frank Muir with a hurl of 88 feet, but Mr. Murray has no doubt as to the quality of the Dufftown hurling. "I think the world champion could well be in danger," he said. "The hurling haggis is 1.5 pounds for the official event, but I've seen people in Buckie hurl 120 feet with a 2.5 pound haggis." Buckie butcher Mr. Alex Stewart is providing the haggis, made to a recipe handed down from his father. "This is the most unusual request I've had, and I'm delighted to be asked," he said, but added wistfully, "Of course, we'd prefer people to eat them rather than throw them away." Mr. Dunseith, probably the world's leading authority on the ethics of the sport, explained that the haggis must be aerodynamically sound and must not burst on impact. Yellow card. The clerk of the heather rules each hurl fair or foul. The hurlers can be shown the yellow card as in football. They can also be shown the red card for a dangerous or indecent hurl. "You sometimes get an indecent hurl when the hurler is wearing the kilt," said Mr. Dunseith cryptically. He felt unable to say at this stage whether Scots would outshine other nationalities in this revival of a traditional Scottish sport. However, we should have the answer by next year, he said. The association has had requests to organise competitions in North America, Australia, New Zealand, Nigeria and Singapore. Only one problem threatens to mar the event. Some Dufftown residents are afraid that visiting tourists may misunderstand the nature of the sport. "They may think the hurled haggises are grouse and shoot them down," said one man, "and a trigger-happy mob is something the Gala Week can do without." And so ends our roundup of ancient Scottish sports, brought to you by myself. And if we have any fans of any of the sports mentioned, I hope that maybe I've given you information about it that you perhaps weren't aware of. And we may see you for the next one. Take care.